Do you ever get that feeling? Like carrying around this weight, you know, this stain that just won't go away.
Yeah.
It's like trying to scrub grape juice out of a white carpet. No matter what you do, it's there, mocking your best efforts. Then you stumble across this phrase, this image, white as snow, and it just kind of lands differently. There's this powerful promise baked into it, a promise we're diving into today. Our deep dive today takes us to the book of Isaiah, specifically chapter 1, verses 18 through 20. We're not just skimming the surface here. We're going deep on what this passage meant back then, and more importantly, what it revealed about God and ourselves, even now. Okay, so imagine yourself plopped down in ancient Judah. It's a bit of a mess, to put it mildly. People are straying from their faith. Injustice is rampant, and the whole social fabric is fraying. It's into this darkness, this utter chaos, that God speaks these words. And let me tell you, they're not what you'd expect.
Instead of this fiery condemnation, there's this unexpected invitation to talk, to work things out. It's less, you messed up big time, and more. Come on, let's figure this out together. It's a fascinating glimpse into how God approaches us, even or maybe especially when we're at our worst. What's remarkable to me is that God is the one initiating this dialogue. It's not us begging for forgiveness. It's him saying, come now, let us settle the matter. What's the significance of this? Of God taking the first step, so to speak.
That's what makes this passage so profound. It completely flips the script on how we often perceive God and religion. It's not about groveling for mercy. It's about responding to an invitation to intimacy. Think about it, God. The all-powerful creator of the universe chooses to engage with humanity on personal terms. He's not laying down the law from on high, but extending a hand saying, let's talk. It suggests the longing for connection, even in the midst of conflict, that goes beyond mere obedience.
Yeah, it's like he's not just interested in us following the rules, but in us wanting to be in relationship with him. It's the difference between a master and his servant and a father longing for his child to come home.
Exactly. And the word settle is crucial here. It implies a dispute, sure, but also a desire for resolution. God isn't interested in simply dictating the terms of surrender. He wants to work things out collaboratively. This idea, this settling of matters, points to something we see throughout the Bible, God's desire for a covenant relationship with humanity.
Okay, let's unpack that covenant is a big word. What does it actually mean in this context?
It's more than just a contract or an agreement. It's a binding promise based on love and faithfulness. Think of it as a sacred bond where both parties are committed to each other's well-being. God isn't just offering a temporary fix. He's proposing a lifelong journey together.
That's huge EE. It's not about erasing the past and moving on. It's about stepping into a completely new way of relating to God.
And what's incredible is that he initiates this covenant while we're still mired in our mess. It speaks volumes about the nature of his love. It's not based on our performance, our ability to be good enough, but offered freely even when we're at our worst.
Okay, that's seriously challenging some preconceived notions here. But before we get too comfortable with this idea of a loving, relational God, the passage gets real with its description of sin. And it does it with this incredibly vivid image. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Give us some historical context here. What did scarlet symbolize in that time and place?
Scarlet wasn't just any color in ancient Judah. It held immense cultural and economic weight. This dye, extracted from a particular type of beetle, was insanely expensive to produce. Imagine a shade of red so vibrant, so rich, that it became associated with royalty, luxury, even power.
So not just your average red shirt. Then this is high-end statement-making stuff.
Absolutely. But here's where it gets interesting. From a theological standpoint, scarlet dye was known for being incredibly difficult to remove. Once fabric was dyed scarlet, that color was there to stay. It was a permanent marker of sorts.
Wow. So it's not just about the color itself, but what it represented, something ingrained, unchangeable. It's like this stain that seeped into the very fabric of who they are, right?
You've got it. And when you connect that to the concept of sin being a stain on the soul, something that separates us from God, well, it paints a pretty bleak picture.
It's like this weight that just keeps dragging you down, a constant reminder of your failings. You start to think, this is who I am now, I'm permanently marked.
And that's precisely why the contrast with white as snow is so powerful. It's not a superficial cleaning, a quick fix. It speaks to a complete transformation, a restoration to a state of purity that feels impossible from a human standpoint.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more about this transformation, this idea of scarlet sins becoming white as snow.
Yeah.
How does that even happen?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that's sparked debate for centuries. But at its core, this transformation points to the overwhelming, completely undeserved grace of God.
So it's not about earning our way back, but being good enough to deserve this cleansing.
Exactly. It's not about our efforts, but about surrendering to his.
Yeah.
This passage is a powerful reminder that no one is beyond the reach of God's love and forgiveness. It's available to everyone, regardless of the depth of their sin, the permanence of their scarlet stains, so to speak.
That's an incredibly hopeful message, especially in a world where we're often defined by our mistakes. It's like this radical affirmation that no matter how messed up we think we are, a clean slate is always possible.
But here's the catch, and this is where things get really interesting.
I knew there had to be a catch. There's always a catch.
Yeah.
All right, lay it on me. What's the fine print on this whole white as snow deal?
Well, the passage doesn't exactly bury the lead. Right after this incredible image of transformation, we get this line, "If you are willing and obedient, you will eat the good things of the land, but if you resist and rebel, you will be devoured by the sword."
Okay, yeah, talk about a mood swing.
Okay.
One minute it's all warm fuzzies and fresh starts. The next is like follow the rules or ELSE. So is this where the whole covenant thing gets a little less warm and fuzzy?
Yeah.
Like, hey, I love you unconditionally, BUT.
It's easy to read it that way, but I think that misses the nuance of what's being said. Remember, this whole message is framed as an invitation to a deeper relationship with God, a covenant based on love and mutual commitment. So when we talk about obedience in this context, it's not about blind rule following out of fear, but about a response to that love, a desire to align our lives with the heart of the one who knows us best.
Okay, so less about a cosmic checklist
And more about
and more about what does it look like to be willing and obedient in light of this covenant relationship?
Think of it this way. Imagine a parent teaching their child to ride a bike. The child might be scared at first, unsure of the rules, maybe even a little resistant to the whole idea, but the parent, out of love, keeps encouraging, guiding, and yes, even setting boundaries to keep the child safe. The goal isn't to restrict the child's freedom, but to help them experience the joy and freedom that comes with mastering a new skill.
And I'm guessing that's kind of how God views us when it comes to this whole obedience thing.
Sure.
It's not about stifling our individuality,
Right.
but about helping us navigate life in a way
Yeah.
that leads to true flourishing.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that his guidance, his rules, if you will, are ultimately for our good, even when we don't fully understand them in the moment.
You know, it's funny you mentioned the parent-child analogy. Growing up, I was the king of pushing boundaries. My poor parents, bless their hearts. I vividly remember one incident involving a meticulously constructed mud fort in the middle of our living room. Let's just say there were tears, and they weren't all mine.
I have a feeling there's a good story there. But I think that perfectly illustrates the point. As kids, we often obey out of fear of punishment, or because we haven't yet developed the capacity for understanding the why behind the rules.
Oh, I definitely didn't understand the why behind keeping the mud outside. But as I matured, eventually, I started to get it. My parents weren't trying to crush my architectural dreams. They were trying to protect our carpets and probably my sanity.
Exactly. And in a similar way, as we grow in our relationship with God, our obedience becomes less about avoiding punishment and more about trusting his heart, his wisdom, even when it's tough to understand.
So it's less about a rigid set of thou shalt and thou shalt nots, and more about this ongoing process of aligning our hearts and wills with his.
You've got it. And that alignment, that willingness to surrender our own limited perspective for a glimpse of his, is where we start to experience the true good things of the land the passage talks about.
Okay, hold up. I have to ask. When Isaiah mentions eating the good things of the land, is that meant literally, or is there a deeper meaning there?
It's a great question. And like much of the Bible, it operates on multiple levels. On a practical level, in ancient Israel, abundance of crops and flocks was a sign of God's blessing. But it goes deeper than that. The good things represent a life of wholeness, of spiritual nourishment, a deep sense of peace and joy that comes from living in right relationship with God and with others.
So it's less about material wealth and more about, what would you say?
Imagine it like this. There's a richness, a fullness to life that we can only experience when we're connected to the source of life itself. It's not about following rules to earn God's favor, but about recognizing that his way, the path of willing and obedient living, is what ultimately leads to true flourishing.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But, and I hate to be a downer here, the passage doesn't just offer sunshine and roses, does it? We've got this whole devoured by the sword thing looming over our heads, which, let's be honest, puts a bit of a damper on the whole good things of the land vibe.
I hear you. It's definitely a stark contrast, and I don't think it's an accident. This image of judgment, while unsettling, serves a crucial purpose in the narrative.
All right, so what's the deal with the sword? Is God just trying to scare us into obedience?
Remember that parent-child analogy. Sometimes love requires setting boundaries, even if it means allowing our loved ones to experience the natural consequences of their choices. And that's where this image of the sword comes in.
Okay, so less about God being a vengeful deity
Yeah.
and more about What? Help me connect the dots here.
Think of it as tough love. On a cosmic scale, God isn't sitting up there with a giant metaphorical sword, just waiting for us to mess up so he can dole out punishment. It's more like he's saying, look, I love you too much to let you walk blindly into harm's way. Here are the stakes, the potential consequences of choosing to live out of alignment with me, the source of life.
That's surprisingly reassuring, actually.
Yeah.
It's like he's not threatening us,
Yeah.
but trying to protect us
Uh-huh.
from the inevitable pain that comes with choosing a path that leads away from him. Kind of like a, look, I've been down this road, trust me, it doesn't end well kind of thing.
Exactly. And I think that's where the true heart of God shines through. Even in what seems like a harsh warning, it's not about control or punishment. It's about love, about wanting what's truly best for us, even when we're too stubborn or short-sighted to see it ourselves.
So what I'm hearing is this passage, even the parts that seem scary or intense, is ultimately about freedom, right? The freedom to choose, but also the freedom that comes from choosing wisely.
You're spot on. It's recognizing that true freedom isn't about doing whatever we want whenever we want, but about aligning ourselves with the one who designed us for a purpose, who knows the path to true flourishing, even if it's not always the easy one.
All right, that's a lot to process. We've covered a lot of ground here, from ancient dye practices to cosmic parenting analogies. But before we get too comfortable with these grand ideas, I can't help but wonder, how does this all play out in the day-to-day? What does this whole willing and obedient thing actually look like in our modern lives?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's one that's both deeply personal and surprisingly practical. It's about making choices, big and small, that reflect this desire to live in alignment with God's heart.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give us some examples. What kind of choices are we talking about here? So give us some concrete examples. What kind of choices are we talking about here when we talk about living out this willing and obedient life in the modern world?
Well, it could be something as simple as putting someone else's needs before your own,
Yeah.
like choosing to be patient in a frustrating situation or offering a helping hand, even when you're already feeling stretched thin.
So it's about those everyday acts of kindness, of selflessness, those little things that might seem insignificant on their own, but when practiced consistently, start to weave a different kind of tapestry in our lives.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our lives are not isolated compartments. Our choices have ripple effects that impact those around us.
And sometimes those ripples extend far beyond our immediate circle, right? Like when we choose to support ethical businesses or advocate for those who are marginalized, those choices can have a real impact on the world around us.
Absolutely. And I think that's where this whole idea of willing and obedient living gets really exciting, because it connects our everyday actions to a much larger story, a story of redemption, of restoration, of hope for a world that desperately needs it.
Okay, so we're talking about a faith that's not just about our own personal piety, but about actively participating in the healing of the world.
You got it. It's about recognizing that we're not just called to be consumers of grace, but conduits of it, channels through which God's love can flow out into the world. And sometimes that means getting our hands dirty, stepping outside of our comfort zones, and embracing the messy, beautiful, often challenging work of being agents of change.
So how do we do that? How do we move from these heady concepts to actually living them out in a way that feels authentic and sustainable?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer. But I do believe it starts with a posture of humility, a willingness to admit that we don't have all the answers, and a deep trust in the one who does.
So it's about surrendering our need to control every outcome and trusting that even when we stumble, even when we mess up, God's grace is big enough to meet us right where we are.
Absolutely. Remember that image of scarlet sins becoming white as snow? That's not a one-and-done deal. It's a daily surrender, a constant choosing to walk in step with the Spirit, allowing Him to guide our thoughts, our words, our actions.
It's about becoming more and more like Christ every single day.
You got it. And that's a journey I'm willing to bet none of us will ever fully master this side of eternity, but it's a journey worth taking.
It definitely feels like we've just scratched the surface here. But if there's one thing I want our listeners to take away from this deep dive, it's that this whole idea of willing and obedient living, it's not about striving for some unattainable standard of perfection. It's about embracing the messy, beautiful, often challenging process of becoming more like Christ with each passing day.
Beautifully said. And you know what? I think that's a pretty good definition of what it means to be human, to be fully alive, to embrace the journey with all its twists and turns, knowing that we're held and loved by a God whose grace is always sufficient.
Amen to that. Well, folks, there you have it, another deep dive in the books. Until next time, keep wrestling, keep exploring, and keep seeking that transformative love that can turn even the darkest of stains white as snow.